I am very honored to give this talk today. Like many people in this room, Herb talks were talks with Herb, that is, very formative in my thinking and my career. This phrase really captures one of Herb's important ideas, I think. This idea that, that science had a duty to pay back to society for the public investment in research. And this idea was not a new idea. In fact, it's the very foundation upon which our federal government has invested in scientific research. But most of that payback had been in terms of the transfer of science into technology for winning wars, winning the space race, curing disease. And here, the formative idea might not be the payback part so much as what we're paying back with. And that is the knowledge of how nature works. The idea that that itself could be a beneficial contribution to the well-being of humanity, and that should be a focus of our payback efforts. So, what does that payback imperative mean? Is it still relevant today? And if it is, how do we meet that challenge? So let's start with context. I have some bad news to report, unfortunately, about the state of our planet and the context in which we must consider this payback. Work by Vatusic et al. And Hook and Martin tells us that about 80% of the Earth's ice-free land area has been modified by human activities. Some 60% of nitrogen fixation is caused by human activities. And we use about half of the accessible surface fresh water available in the world. In the US, only about 2% of our rivers flow unimpeded, and many of them never make it to the sea. Will Steffen, in a 2004 paper with the IGBP, looked at these trends of human influence over the Earth using 24 different indicators, and found that not only do we have a dominant human footprint on the Earth today, but that that footprint is accelerating, with an inflection point for many of these indicators from the period of 1915 to today. And he called that the Great Acceleration. So that's kind of daunting context for this payback work we must do. But he went on to make it even harder to say that over the next 2 decades or so, the decisions we make about how we interact with the planet will determine the direction of this line, whether it's to overshoot or to a bending that can support Earth's functions and human well-being. And he took actually some comfort that this bending could be an age of stewardship, with evidence that he was seeing a filtering down of knowledge to decisions. Well, I'm here to tell you that I don't think a filtering down is going to do it. I think the Great Acceleration needs to be in how we meet this payback imperative. And I think Gene, in the early 90s, knew this too, in his piece on human accelerated environmental change, where he tells us that we need our best efforts at all levels. And I know, and I'm pretty sure, maybe he could confirm, that that includes working at this level too. The good news is that the path forward does include some important opportunities and second chances. And I want to point out 3 big ones that I think overlap very well with the expertise and the knowledge base here at Hubbard Brook and represent an opportunity for this community in particular to do payback in a way that has real impact. The first is forests and our forest history. This is from David Foster, but applies to the region and reminds us that we have this return of forests over the last 150-year period, bringing our forests back to a peak in forest cover, a regreening of this region, and a tremendous opportunity to determine the fate, a second chance to determine the fate of the forests. But what will that be? It will be largely in the hands of the decisions of many, many landowners, government agencies, public officials to determine, and we already see a bit of a downturn, a second wave of forest loss, mostly in the form of a hard deforestation, much more difficult to return from than the period of agricultural clearing. This community, better than anybody, understands that dynamics of forest change and what that means, and communicating that will be essential. A second important trend, a potential opportunity for change, for bending the curve, is the trend in coal plant retirements in the US. And this is the cumulative effect of many, many decades of both research, communication, and policy, where we see from the EIA projected coal plant retirements hitting a peak around this time and a second peak out in 2015. That is a huge opportunity to reconsider what our energy systems should look like in the future. Water is a third opportunity. So this graph shows from 1995 out to 2040 the gap in infrastructure spending on water systems, both wastewater and drinking water. This is both an incredible need and a huge opportunity. Most of these systems, as you all know, have depended on gray infrastructure to channel water, to clean water, abandoning the functions of natural ecosystems and replacing them with very energy-intensive alternatives. That is something that, as we abandon and strand that infrastructure, is both a need and an opportunity for change. So thinking about, clearly, we have a human-dominated planet where human decisions are playing a very important role. We know from what Fred Krupp told us and what we have experienced here at Hubbard Brook that science can play a tremendous and important role in informing those decisions. And so how do we do that from here? How, in this period of great acceleration, can we contribute to the bending? I want to do two things. I want to look at some very early thinking by Herb, some foundational ideas, look to the practices and experiences here at Hubbard Brook, and propose a few ideas for going forward. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Herb's work as an ecologist. He also published widely on broader ideas about human-nature interactions. And going back to those ideas, I think, provide some of our strongest insights for the future. This is a 1976 paper called The Inseparable Linkage: The Conservation of Natural Ecosystems and Fossil Energy. And this reminds us that the payback imperative, in Herb's envisioning of that, must include an appreciation and understanding and communication of ecosystem thinking, and as captured in this diagram. So this was an early diagram. I actually think it's quite artful, includes a lot of prescient ideas about ecosystem services and the influence of inputs. People have built on this, have taken issue with it. In the age of the Anthropocene, or of human-accelerated environmental change, what is missing from this diagram? People. People are missing from this diagram. Well, Stuart Pickett and others have added this to this diagram, have changed it to consider suburbs, to consider urban areas. But I'm actually less worried about what's missing from this diagram than our complete failure to incorporate the central idea of this diagram into our decisions. And that's up here. So Nick told us that these systems are actually incredibly inefficient at converting solar energy to biological energy. But nonetheless, that process of converting solar energy through photosynthesis to functions that support life has been a core idea of ecosystem thinking. And he reminds us that as we degrade ecosystems, the alternative that we replace them with are often add further to the degradation, creating a situation where we have this: the diminution of solar-powered natural systems and the expansion of fossil-powered human systems are currently locked in a positive feedback cycle. So he calls this the positive feedback syndrome. If that isn't the description of a runaway system in great acceleration, I don't know what is. And so this understanding of ecosystem thinking has to guide how we consider those three opportunities for change in land, in energy, and in water. The other thing I would say about positive feedback cycles that we have to learn from ecosystem thinking, of course, is that there are tremendous opportunity to drive them in the reverse. And so to the extent that we can drive that backwards and gain the multiplier benefits of reducing reliance on fossil-powered options and return to more ecologically powered functions, we'll make tremendous gains. And so that may be considered naive utopian thinking, but we have two reasons to think it's not. One is we're seeing this transition already. The transition from greater green infrastructure and water management, the consideration of adaptation strategies to climate change that also mitigate by relying on green infrastructure, thereby reducing fossil fuel emissions, are two good examples. The other reason we shouldn't dismiss it as naive is that Herb also reminds us in his early thinking that utopian thinking may in fact be necessary to meeting the payback imperative, especially in a time of great transition. So in his 1972 paper, Growing, Growing, Gone, Herb puts forward this idea that utopian thinking could actually be necessary. And he points out that it's not the road to serfdom or boredom. It's the stockpiling of ideas and new possibilities that can lay the groundwork for larger fundamental change. And when we have no analog to how we manage, from history, how we manage our Earth systems, we need the value of forward-looking thinking to guide our decisions. So the heart of this idea can be found in a 1967 children's book, interestingly enough, written around the same time, called Frederick, in which Frederick spends his days apparently daydreaming, not contributing to the gathering and storing of food for winter that the other mice are involved in. And when they turn to him and say, "Frederick, why don't you work?" he says, "I do work. I gather the rays of the sun for the cold, dark winter days." And as the story goes on, when they have consumed all of their resources in the depths of winter, they turn to Frederick, and it is his memory of the power of the sun that sustains them. The power of the sun to sustain them. I just think it's so apt. We can't miss the connection, I don't think, between this book, Frederick Herbert Borman, and the kind of thinking we need today. So the third element of some of Herb's early writings that I think we would do well to remember is this idea that visionary thinking by itself is not enough for change. We need to engage with society in a very active way. And he proposed the idea of congresses. And because it was the 70s, he called them survival congresses. And you need to get together experts, lay people, think about our current condition, what does the future hold, and design solutions together. So the idea extended well beyond science communication. It included this idea of two-way exchange. It did not presume a deficit model where we just think people don't have enough information. We just need to throw information at them to change behavior. He understood that the process of engagement was much deeper than that. So to meet the payback imperative, I think, requires that we learn from these early writings about the value of systems thinking, the importance of understanding that you cannot solve problems with the same mindset that created them, and that we need to engage, not just push out information. And so that requires that we create times and places for this kind of thinking, that we develop the ability to think in systems, and that we communicate that effectively. And there we have a final quote from this paper, that we need widespread communication to create the necessary receptivity for basic change to occur. So we go from Herb's early thinking to the incredibly deep experience at Hubbard Brook of science in action. There are many examples of this, from lead to forest practices to bird habitat. And I'm going to share today, following the theme of others, a few examples from air pollution. First, I have to say that if we are going to continue to hope to have any impact on this great transition, we need to continue in the tradition of the scientific rigor that Gene, Herb, Tom Sikkema, Dick Holmes, Charlie Driscoll, and so many others have established. It provides the ability to identify problems, to understand their effects, to track their response to changes in inputs, and to evaluate the effectiveness of policy. And the integrity and the rigor of that work and the importance of that in impact and action cannot be understated. And I think we know that from the acid rain days. And Gene and others could tell you what that experience must have been like. But the ability to withstand assault is critical in the kind of change that we're talking about. There will be interests with deep pockets, with great political influence, that will attack the science and attack the people behind the science. And so Gene's commitment to integrity and to rigor must be part of what we continue to invest in here at Hubbard Brook and beyond. And the secondary benefit of that rigor is that it provides a foundation for a wealth of publications to continue to raise awareness over time. And so here I just took a look at the publications in the Hubbard Brook Ecosystem Study database that cited acid rain over time, together with newspaper coverage in the green line. So the blue bars are Hubbard Brook publications, the green line is acid rain coverage in the media, and you see this incredible correspondence. It is just amazing to think that the science to public awareness to action link was so tightly coupled around the acid rain debate. And that is something we would do well to remember. I did have to add to that diagram some additional publications related to pollution topics, just to be sure that I didn't leave anyone with the impression that scientific productivity was falling off here at Hubbard Brook. In fact, it's only expanded over time, adding additional papers on more and more relevant topics, with a trajectory to have a very high publication rate in this decade as well. So the reality is, however, though, that despite that kind of what I would call an inciting incidents in the acid rain wars, the policy change is in fact a very long-term incremental process that requires that continued publication, that continued rigor over decades, and continued engagement over decades. The top bar here just shows a quick timeline of policy advances related to acid rain. The middle bar is policy advances related to mercury and air toxics. And the bottom bar in green are policy advances related to greenhouse gas emissions in the electric utility industry. So this has been a long haul. And Hubbard Brook Science has been involved in many, if not most, of these decisions along the way. And it's only with this cumulative, incremental policy change over decades that we begin to see the potential for an actual transformation in the system. So acid rain, ratcheting down over time, plus mercury, plus the pending greenhouse gas standards for new and existing power plants have put a squeeze on coal plants, moving to that retirement trend that you saw earlier, allowing us to actually have a system that begins to look different. But it was many, many individual actions and the ability to see that we not only have to think big and think in systems, but have to work toward small incremental changes over time that amount to big system shifts. And that persistence and that integrity is a hallmark of the Hubbard Brook Ecosystem Study, which is what I believe will continue to make this place a center for that kind of leadership. So it's also true, I think, that the effort that it takes, whether we call it science communication or outreach or engagement, the effort that it takes to drive that kind of incremental change over decades is enormous. And here again, we have pioneering leadership from Hubbard Brook in that work. We have learned a tremendous amount about how to do this. Science communication started with the publication of scientific papers. Jean, Herb, and others, I think, in their experience, identified the need to be able to communicate that effectively to the media in order for it to have impact. I think we know now that the incremental change requires a dedicated campaign of that kind. We have to be able to build on that success over time with future generations of spokespeople in a very deliberate and strategic way. And that meant the creation of the Science Links program here at Hubbard Brook. Again, tremendous leadership from Hubbard Brook in creating this program, I believe. I was very lucky to be part of it, but it was their commitment to the impact of science on society that laid the foundation for that work. I think when I added up, Charlie Driscoll has contributed to at least 10, if not 12, of these publicly directed synthesis publications targeted to research to get the science out there that's been so important to that incremental policy change leading to systems redesign. Many, many people, dozens of people, have contributed to every single one of those publications. We know this model of producing papers and doing press releases got us started. The campaign had to continue with very deliberate activities to synthesize that research at key moments, targeted at particular policy questions, couple it with policy outreach campaigns and media outreach, and now we're moving forward from there. Hubbard Brook is helping to lead the next stage of this in something called the Science Policy Exchange. This right now is probably best described as a big dream, but it imagines that we work across institutions from different LTR sites representing a gradient of impacts from subtle human impact to much more direct, that we have the ability to take on a range of problems in a campaign type way over time with both ecologists and human health experts, with research as well as practitioners in areas from communication to design, and that we build in the thinking of social scientists around public attitudes, communication, and policy. So, what does that mean for the payback imperative? Well, it means that it takes an army, I think. It means that it takes persistence and thick skin to go with the big vision, and a sense of strategy and innovation. We can train individual scientists in science communication, but I think we know it's going to take much, much, much more than that. Training individuals is a start, but I would suggest that we need to actually change our conceptual models for what we think about the systems that we work in. If science communication is to be, that needs to be the great acceleration. Our work in translating science for policy, science to action, that needs to be the great acceleration if we are to have the bend. So I'd like to suggest that we need to change our view of the boundaries of the systems to bring in the connection to human decisions directly into our models of how we work. So this is not just a token change, I think. It creates a place to be having these decisions about how we take information about ecosystems and link it to action, and then how that in turn affects the impacts of human on those ecosystems. It allows us to draw in ecosystem scientists, social scientists, to train the next generations of students in this work, to consider these as experiments that need rigor, to assess and to learn how to do this over time, and perhaps most importantly, to dedicate resources to this activity as part of the larger scientific enterprise. We have been doing this on a shoestring. And if we look to medical research, they have it right. They have programs designed for translational research. They have bench-to-bedside programs funded by the NIH. They have a major initiative called Faster Cures. We need faster cures. We need to begin to show this in our model, invest in it, and build and innovate in this area to help to contribute to the great bending. The other part of the payback imperative, I think, is to be able to step back just a little bit from our own understanding of the systems we work in to a larger guiding framework. In the early 1900s, science to action meant protecting areas from human influence, establishing national parks, national forests. In the 1960s and 70s, Hubbard Brooke ushered in the era of no land is an island, that we need, the boundaries are transparent and open, and we need a new kind of environmental policy to protect that. And I think we're now moving into yet another phase where we need to understand that we are managing systems and we need to manage with nature. And that phrase, with nature, comes directly from Herb, because he stated that managing with nature means with an understanding of how ecosystems work. So this is stepping back even further. This is an enormous challenge. Most of the impact that we see come from the areas in colors here, blue, red, and green, which represent the carbon dioxide emissions across the globe, mostly the red being in the high economically developed areas. But we know the situation is changing. A large part of the population lives in areas that need resource development for equity and poverty alleviation. If you look at this map of threats of water security, it's just the inverse. And so clearly there'll be another wave of development in other parts of the world that will continue to drive human impacts. And so it is that the challenge is great, and we need better examples. We need leading examples, and I believe this is the place to do it. You have the geography of opportunity, with at least the 3 examples we showed at the beginning. You have the foundation of ecosystem thinking and all that it implies, analytical rigor, and a leadership in science communication. And you have, perhaps most importantly, a group of people, the army that it could take to make this happen. So gather the rays of the sun. We'll need the right kind of energy. Join a team. We'll need each other. And make your influence felt. Thank you.
So we have time for a question or two for Kathy. I realize it's the end of a long day. Not quite the end. The break is about to happen. But, any quick questions for Kathy? Here, Dick.
Well, Kathy, it's been a
Hi.
while since we've seen each other.
Good to see you.
I really like part of what you're saying. And I'm disturbed by other parts of it. Because I think the model of science policy is too slow a model. And I don't think we have the time to make that progression. And if we are, as I feel we are, within 10 or 15 years of the methane black rates wiping out the whole game, 20, 25, pick a number, but sooner than later, the urgency of what we're trying to accomplish strikes me as something where we have to start implementing scalable solutions now as part of the work that's going on here. So we're in a state with many, many communities that are suffering grievously from energy prices, and where the work of Hubbard Brooke could really make a difference. And one of the key things that has been missing from this morning is there's been no economic discussion. There's no financing. There's no way of taking the science and turning it into action on the ground that's scalable, except through the policy mechanism. And I would like to see Hubbard Brooke take its position of credibility and add that component to what they're doing because New Hampshire is potentially a great laboratory to show worldwide examples of how to do sustainable implementation at a scalable level on these energy sides. And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think we do agree. I probably didn't capture that completely in the 15, 20 minutes here. I think the challenge is enormous, but it has to start with scalable leading examples. And I think in the area of forest management, water management, and energy, Harbor Brook has great strength. And starting here, or starting someplace where there is a pressing opportunity, is very important. Great Bay, nitrogen loading to Great Bay, whether we explore energy-intensive alternatives to that or options that could promote sprawl as opposed to a range of other solutions, is a critical example. Something scalable. It's a problem that exists all across the US as we have impaired waters and crumbling infrastructure. So the question of energy, exploring the role of biomass and forests in meeting that demand, again, I know it's on the thinking of people here. Another good example. And on the issue of energy and continuing to push that transformation, through the Science Policy Exchange, we do have a new project called the Coal Impact Project that will bring in human health people from the Harvard School of Public Health as well as economists at a time when we know that there will be a push for the next level of regulatory pressure on coal plants for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Again, piece of the puzzle, but taken as part of a larger picture, very important and scalable to other parts of the world. So I agree with you completely. As we are tinkering with what the conceptual model looks like, which comes completely out of my frustration for not doing enough of this and not having the capacity to do it fast enough, we keep working those examples. And we keep engaging with people who can help remind us what the best opportunities are and where we need to do that. So thank you for the question.
And I'll just take the moderator's prerogative here to add a little bit to that. I think one of the things we have to think about here at Hubbard Brook going forward is how do we do what we do well here at Hubbard Brook and look at those linkages? And is it to do the economics or is it to make sure we align? So the work that certainly I was involved with Walmart almost a decade ago, believe me, there was lots of economics in that. They didn't make an investment in many things. They've made the biggest investment in any corporation in reducing their carbon footprint in America, and they did it with economists. And so there are a lot. It's not here at Hubbard Brook, but I think as a community we have to decide, is it bringing economists here, or is it reaching out to communities and making sure the information we generate here flows into those communities and aids that conversation? And
no matter how you do it, I mean, my view too is that we have put this burden on the backs of individual scientists for far too long. To expect that a scientist producing a rigorous record like that will at the same time engage in the way that it demands to do the kinds of things we're talking about, in my opinion, is just unrealistic and won't give us the acceleration. We need to invest in a collaboration core, a place around which we bring these people together to come up with scalable solutions and to communicate that more broadly. The cost to any individual, the ability to sustain that over time, is not there with the way that we've been doing it. I mean, we are eternally grateful to the individuals who've done that in the past, and we need to learn and go forward from there.
Looking to see if there's another last question.
I'll ask you this as a non-scientist and as an observer. How much do you talk to the general lay public? I mean, this meeting is scientists talking to scientists. Do you talk to the press? Do you talk to politicians? Now, does Hubbard Brook itself, as well as individual scientists, have that level of outreach? Not only this very sophisticated level.
I would say all the time. People get calls about the birds in their backyard, as Dick can well attest, get cold calls from reporters. Most people are very generous in that. So I would say all the time. And it depends on the hot topic of the day. And I guess part of what I'm saying is that for it to make a difference and to lead to change, it has to be much more strategic. It has to be directed with some thinking about where are the best opportunities. You could be, in fact, inundated with that kind of interaction. How do you choose and design the ones that will have the greatest impact? I think we also know, though, from this idea of congresses and utopian thinking, that there is a place for going back to just throwing the doors open and inviting in a dialogue. And I would say that's around issues like land use change, where the influencers, the determinants of that change are many, many individuals across a large area. And that takes a different kind of approach altogether. Scenario thinking, exchange with large populations of people with diverse opinions and viewpoints. So don't be disheartened by the science talks, please.
And one thing, I know we've got a couple of questions and we need to break it off, but I do want to add is there is more outreach than maybe seems apparent we talked about now. And I'll just mention one thing, Will Abbott sitting here in the Forest Society, the Society of Protection of New Hampshire Forests, it's about 10 years ago now, I believe, put on a event looking at climate change and impacts on the forests and the forest industry in Concord. That several people, I was involved, John Aber, who's somewhere in the audience, I saw him earlier. So Hubbard Brook was extremely heavily involved in that, in which we got 350, and they had to cut it off because the fire marshal wouldn't allow any more people in Concord talking about climate change on logging, on the general public, and the Manchester Union Leader wrote an article about it, positively thinking about those impacts. So for those of you who know New Hampshire well, and that was working directly with the Forest Society. Do we need to do more of that? Absolutely. But I think there's lots of, Pam Templer has been in the news in lots of different ways in the TV and in Boston talking about the experiments up here. But I think to Kathy's point, it's really hard to do it all. And we're at the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation looking for as many ways as possible to expand the leverage and the multiplier of the great work, because you can't ask one person to do everything here. And one way we do that at the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation is we do something, roundtables that, again, many of the scientists here have been involved with, meeting with different communities, talking about current issues relevant to society, whether they're local or regional, and trying to create a dialogue that builds off the great science, but really makes it relevant to the larger publics in the broader sense of that term. I said it was the last, but Jean, we really have the last one. My apologies, we do need to break.
That was a great talk. It provided a lot of food for thought. So I have two questions. I'm not sure I can really conveniently link them. One is, do you think programs like the Aldo Leopold Fellows Program, are there opportunities for expanding or varying on that in the kind of thing you're thinking about? And another extension is, what about citizen science and the role of citizen science?
Yeah, on the first question about, so Jean asked about the Aldo Leopold Fellowship Program, which trains scientists to communicate to policymakers and the public, and about citizen science and their roles in this work. I think the Aldo Leopold program is fantastic. Anyone who I know who's done it, who I know, raves about it. I think it's one really important piece of the puzzle. Again, I think what it tends to do is train scientists to be better communicators. And that is essential. And we need to do more. Because a bunch of individual scientists dispersed across the landscape trained in communication is not going to bring the kind of impact we need. So we need a way to coalesce that at moments where there are key decisions being made to bring that to the table with real impact. And so I'd say it's part, but only part, and we're trying to innovate well past that. I'd love to have them as a partner to provide the training module of the much bigger program.
On the citizen science, just I saw Ellen Denny here. I don't know if there she is. So one of the things, for example, that flows out of Hubbard Brook, Ellen Denny, who's been a long time Hubbard Brook researcher and working with Tom Sickham at Yale for a long time, and then now is currently, pardon? 15 years. On the forest, the work that John Battles talked about is now works on the Phenology Network. Did I get the title right?
Yeah, the National Phenology, USA National Phenology Network.
And that's a citizen science effort to build a national, not just citizen science, but include citizen science.
Professional and citizen science.
You want to say something, because that's a great example of citizen science and how Hubbard Brook fits into that.
Yeah, gosh, I don't know what fits into it other than the fact that.
There's great data sets here that were included,
Yeah,
right?
that's right, yeah, and, so at the National Phenology Network, we do a lot more than just, citizen science stuff. It's professional scientists and citizens trying to, get people to collect phenology data in the same sampling method, so it just makes it much easier to compare across the country and across the globe. We have international partners that are talking to. Yeah, it's just a great engagement thing to get people to understand nature around
So thank you so much, Kathy. Great.